How the mighty have fallen. Talk about jumping right into the deep end, right? We're picking up this explainer at the exact seam where the previous record of 1 Samuel left off. Saul, Israel's very first king, and his incredibly loyal son Jonathan are dead on the blood-stained battlefield of Mount Gilboa. And it's fascinating because this story doesn't kick off with a ticker tape parade for the new king. Instead, it starts with David offering this solemn, agonizing lament. It really sets this grave, deeply cinematic tone for the history we're about to dive into. 2 Samuel, the reign of David. Welcome to our explainer, where we're going to trace the life of one extraordinary man. We'll look at David's life as a single, fully integrated, four-movement narrative. We're going to follow him all the way from his patient rise, right through his devastating ruin, and finally to his sobering recovery.
So, Movement 1, the rise. Chapters 1 through 10 really document David's ascent, and it challenges how we usually think about success. David's rise wasn't an overnight thing at all. He's anointed king of Judah down in Hebron around 1010 BC, but he doesn't just waltz into total control. Nope, he has to wait over 7.5 years. 7.5 years of patient endurance, slogging through a grinding civil war with what's left of Saul's house before the northern tribes finally join him. Ultimately, in 10:3 BC, he is at last crowned king of all Israel.
Once he finally unites the tribes, David makes an absolutely brilliant political move. He captures Jerusalem, which at the time was a heavily fortified Jebusite stronghold. Why there? Because it sat right smack on the border between the northern and southern tribes. It was entirely neutral territory. So by capturing it, David establishes what becomes the City of David. It was the perfect, unifying political capital for his newly forged nation.
But see, David didn't just want a political headquarters, he wanted a spiritual epicenter. So he decides to make Jerusalem the religious heart of the nation by bringing up the Ark of the Covenant. Now this event is a really intense reminder of God's holiness. It actually involves the tragic death of a man named Uzzah, who irreverently touches the Ark. But the whole thing ultimately culminates in this incredible scene. David laying aside all his royal dignity, just joyfully dancing with absolutely all his might before the Lord as the Ark enters the city limits.
And that brings us to chapter 7, which is honestly the prophetic spine of this entire book. Picture this. David is looking around his beautiful new cedar palace, and it suddenly hits him that the Ark of God is still sitting out in a tent. So his plan is to build God a physical house, a massive temple. But God sends the prophet Nathan to completely flip David's architectural ambitions upside down. God basically says, no, you aren't going to build me a house. I am going to build you an everlasting house, a dynasty. And that, right there, is the Davidic covenant.
The language in this unconditional covenant is truly the theological heartbeat of the text. It anchors the great messianic hope of the entire Bible. Because God's promise points so far beyond David's immediate son, Solomon. It points to a future king whose reign will literally never end. Every future hope of a Messiah rests entirely on this one incredible promise.
To cap off the height of David's rise, we get this beautifully quiet moment of intense compassion. David remembers his deep friendship with Jonathan and starts looking for any surviving heirs of Saul's family. He ends up finding Jonathan's crippled son, Mephibosheth, living out in total obscurity. Now back then, a king would normally eliminate a political rival like that, but instead, David gives him a permanent seat at the king's own table. It is such a profound, moving picture of pure grace to the completely undeserving.
Which brings us to Movement 2, the transgression.
Chapters 11 and 12 take a deeply dark turn. The text says, "In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David remained at Jerusalem." Just a single, ominous verse, but it sets this grave, factual stage for the total disaster that's about to unfold. It's a stark reminder of what happens when a leader neglects his post. David was simply in the wrong place at the exact wrong time.
Without any sensationalism, the text just traces David's deliberate step-by-step descent into sin. It goes from idly watching Bathsheba, to abusing his royal power by sending for her, to scrambling in a desperate cover-up when she becomes pregnant. And when her fiercely loyal husband Uriah flat-out refuses to abandon his troops, David orchestrates a proxy murder to silence him permanently. It's a chilling sequence of choices by a man who literally had everything.
But God absolutely does not let this slide. He sends Nathan the prophet back to the king, this time with a brilliant parable about a wealthy man stealing a poor man's beloved little lamb. David gets completely outraged at the injustice in the story, and right then, Nathan shatters the king's elaborate cover-up with 4 piercing words: "You are the man." The aftermath of this brilliantly illustrates the real tension between divine grace and earthly consequences. See, David doesn't make excuses like his predecessor Saul used to do. He immediately confesses, "I have sinned." And in response, he receives profound grace. God spares his life and entirely forgives him. But at the same time, Nathan issues a sobering warning. Because of the violence and the deceit David used, the sword is never going to depart from his own house.
And that leads us directly in to Movement 3, the Troubles. Chapters 13 through 20 detail the agonizing fulfillment of Nathan's warning. The promised sword falls heavily right onto David's own family. We essentially watch this tragic domino effect unfold before our eyes. It starts with his son Amnon's horrific violation of his half-sister Tamar. When David completely fails to act on this, Tamar's brother Absalom takes brutal revenge and murders Amnon. This just breeds a deep, deep bitterness in Absalom, eventually culminating in a full-scale rebellion. He actively steals the hearts of the nation away from his aging father, and he even gets help from David's most trusted advisor, Ahithophel.
The rebellion gains so much traction that David is actually forced into exile. Think about his triumphant entry into the city years earlier. This is the exact, painful reversal of that. A heartbroken David has to flee Jerusalem. He walks away barefoot, his head covered, weeping openly as he climbs the Mount of Olives, just trying to escape a deadly coup orchestrated by his very own son.
Eventually, David's seasoned army manages to crush the rebellion in the forest of Ephraim, and against David's very explicit orders, Absalom is killed. But when the news gets back to David, any sense of political victory is just entirely swallowed up by the ultimate, agonized heartbreak of a grieving father. He cries out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you." The kingdom is saved, but the king is utterly broken.
Finally, we reach Movement 4, the Epilogue. Spanning chapters 21 to 24, this last section acts as a sort of thematic appendix. It closes the record of David's reign by resolving the major themes of his life, and the book concludes with one final moment of failure and recovery. David orders this really prideful military census, which brings a massive plague upon Israel. Realizing his guilt, he seeks to make atonement. He's directed to build an altar, and he insists on buying a very specific piece of land from a man named Araunah the Jebusite. David famously declares that he absolutely will not offer to God something that costs him nothing.
Now, this exact threshing floor that David purchases, it's not just some random piece of real estate. This is Mount Moriah. It is the very same ground where, centuries earlier, Abraham had bound Isaac. And it is the exact site where David's son Solomon would eventually build the great future temple. Talk about things coming full circle.
And that leaves us with a really profound question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Look at the whole arc we've traced today, the rise, the ruin, the recovery. How does the life of this incredibly flawed yet deeply repentant shepherd king standing at an altar on Mount Moriah point forward? Because it perfectly sets the stage for the ultimate resolution of that Davidic covenant we talked about, the eternal Son of David who would one day build an everlasting kingdom. Think about how this ancient history connects directly to the greatest hopes we still hold on to today. I'm going to leave you to reflect on that.